Animal Farm, the story behind the story. Welcome. I am Melesias. Today, we are opening a book that looks, at first glance, like a simple fairy tale. A story about talking animals who rebel against their farmer. It is short. It is funny. It is deeply strange. But do not be fooled by the pigs and the horses and the sheep. This is not a book for children. It is one of the most devastating political satires ever written, a story about how a beautiful dream of freedom and equality can be twisted, step by step, into a nightmare of tyranny and betrayal. We are opening Animal Farm by George Orwell. Orwell was not just a writer. He was a soldier, a journalist, and a deeply committed democratic socialist who fought against fascism in the Spanish Civil War. He had seen, with his own eyes, how the Russian Revolution of 1917, which had promised to liberate the working class, had been betrayed. Under Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union had become a brutal dictatorship, where the ideals of equality and justice were used as propaganda to mask the greed and cruelty of a new ruling class. Orwell was horrified. He wanted to expose this betrayal to the world. But how? How do you explain a complex, sprawling political horror in a way that anyone, anywhere, could understand instantly? The answer came to him in a flash of genius. A fable. A simple, timeless story about animals. If only the animals could talk, he thought, they would tell us what really happens when the revolution is betrayed. And so, in 1943, during the darkest days of the Second World War, Orwell began to write this little book. He faced rejection after rejection. Publishers were afraid of offending Stalin, who was then a crucial ally of Britain against Hitler. But Orwell persisted. The book was finally published in 1945, just as the war was ending and the Cold War was about to begin. It was an instant sensation, a bestseller that shocked and delighted readers in equal measure. It tells the story of Manor Farm, a place where the animals, inspired by a dream of a better world, rise up and expel their human master. They create their own society, governed by a simple, beautiful set of laws, the 7 commandments of animalism. The most important of these is, all animals are equal. What begins as a utopian dream of freedom, however, slowly, insidiously, turns into something else. The pigs, who are the cleverest animals, begin to take power. And power, as the story will show us, has a way of corrupting absolutely. So, let us enter this world. It looks like a fairy tale. It sounds like a nursery rhyme. But under the surface, a cold, dark, and terrifyingly real lesson is waiting for us. Let us meet the animals. Let us hear the dream. Let the rebellion begin. Part 1, The Dream and the Rebellion. The story begins not with a battle, but with a dream. The old boar, Major, the grand old man of Manor Farm, is the philosopher of the animal world. He is 12 years old, a wise and benevolent figure, and he knows he is approaching the end of his life. On the night before he dies, he calls all the animals on the farm to a secret meeting in the big barn. They come, every one of them, from the powerful horses Boxer and Clover to the stupid, bleating sheep, and the vain, beautiful mare, Molly. Even Moses, the tame raven who tells stories of a paradise called Sugar Candy Mountain, is there. As they settle into the dusty, hay-strewn barn, lit only by a single lantern, old Major tells them of his vision. He tells them that the lives of animals are miserable, short, and full of unending toil. Man, he declares, is the only real enemy we have. Remove man from the scene, and the root cause of hunger and overwork is abolished forever. He tells them that man is a parasite, consuming without producing. The labor of the animals feeds him, clothes him, and shelters him, while they get nothing in return but the bare minimum to keep them alive. A human being is the only creature that consumes without producing. He does not give milk, he does not lay eggs, he is too weak to pull the plow, and he cannot run fast enough to catch rabbits. Yet he is lord of all the animals. The solution, Major tells them, is simple and absolute: rebellion. They must overthrow the tyranny of man and run the farm for themselves. And then, in a moment of pure, soaring hope, he teaches them a song. A song that came to him in his dream, a simple, haunting melody with words that speak of a golden future. It is called, Beasts of England. 3 nights later, old Major dies peacefully in his sleep. The rebellion he had prophesied arrives far sooner than anyone expected, and not through careful planning, but through the sheer, blind stupidity of the human oppressor. Mr. Jones, the owner of Manor Farm, is a drunkard, a broken man who has lost his passion for farming. One Saturday in June, he goes to the village, gets blind drunk, and forgets to feed the animals the next morning. The animals, driven by a raw, painful hunger, can bear it no longer. The cows kick in the door of the store shed. The animals begin to help themselves to the food. Jones and his men rush in with whips, but the animals, united and furious, turn on their oppressors. Boxer the horse, with his immense strength, knocks a stable boy unconscious with a single kick from his iron-shod hoof. Jones, terrified, is butted by a goat and trampled. He and his men flee the farm. The revolution has succeeded. The animals are free. And so, the Manor Farm is no more. The animals, in their first act of sovereignty, destroy every instrument of their former torment. They burn the whips, the bits, the reins, and the cruel spurs in a great, roaring bonfire. And they rename their home Animal Farm. They agree to a set of principles, a new moral code for a new world, painted in great white letters on the side of the barn. These are the 7 commandments of animalism, and the most sacred among them is, all animals are equal. The dream has become a reality. But even in this moment of perfect, innocent hope, a shadow is already beginning to fall. The pigs, who are the most intelligent animals, have taken the milk and the apples for themselves. And the first, quiet step towards a new tyranny has already been taken. The seeds of the tragedy are planted in the very soil of the victory. Part 2, The 7 Commandments and the Brief Happiness. The first harvest after the revolution was a triumph. The animals worked together as they had never worked before. Boxer, the great Shire horse, was the hero of the hour. His immense strength and his simple, unshakable devotion to the cause were an inspiration to everyone. His personal motto, which he repeated constantly, was a simple, powerful phrase: I will work harder. And he did. Every hour of every day. The pigs, who were the most intelligent of the animals, did not perform physical labor. Instead, they supervised, directed, and organized. It was a natural division of labor. Or so it seemed. The harvest was brought in, and the barn was fuller than it had ever been under Mr. Jones. For a brief, shining moment, the dream of old Major was a reality. On Sundays, the animals did not work. They held a solemn ceremony in the big barn. The week's work was reviewed, and resolutions for the next week were debated. The pigs, naturally, proposed all the resolutions. The other animals, who were less clever, voted on them. The highlight of every Sunday meeting was the raising of the new flag, a green field with a white hoof and horn, and the singing of the anthem, Beasts of England. After the formal business, the animals would file past the end wall of the barn, where Snowball, the most brilliant and creative of the pigs, had inscribed the very soul of the rebellion in great, white letters. These were the principles that would guide their new society, the unbreakable laws of animalism. They were simple, clear, and just. And every animal, from the wisest pig to the stupidest sheep, knew them by heart. These commandments were the fortress wall against the return of human tyranny. Man was the enemy, defined by his 2 legs and his clothes. Animals were friends, defined by their 4 legs or wings. The vices of humanity, luxury, drunkenness, murder, and inequality were forever banished. The animals were a single, united family. But even in these early, golden days, there were small, quiet signs that the unity was not as perfect as it seemed. The pigs had taken for themselves the milk and the windfall apples. When questioned by the other animals, Squealer, a brilliant, nimble-tongued pig who served as Napoleon's chief propagandist, had an answer ready. The pigs, he explained, were the brain workers. They needed the milk and apples not for pleasure, but for their health. "You would not want Jones to come back, would you?" he asked, his voice dripping with feigned concern. And the animals, terrified of that ultimate nightmare, agreed. The pigs were not taking. They were sacrificing their own comfort for the good of all. The lie was planted. And it began to grow. Part 3, The Betrayal and the Rise of Terror. The fragile unity of the farm began to crack, and the fault line ran directly between the 2 dominant pigs. Snowball was brilliant, energetic, and full of ideas. He was a true believer in the revolution, spending his days drawing up plans for a windmill that would generate electricity, bringing light, heat, and comfort to every stall. Napoleon, a large, fierce-looking Berkshire boar, was the only pig on the farm who was not clever at speaking. But he had a gift for quiet, patient, and brutal calculation. He wanted power, not progress. Snowball was a visionary. Napoleon was a politician. And between them, a silent, deadly struggle for the soul of the farm began. Napoleon hated the windmill. Snowball championed it. The farm was divided. Every Sunday, the 2 would debate before the assembly. And Snowball, with his eloquence and his brilliant visions, was winning the argument. The day came when the animals were to vote on the windmill. Snowball rose and gave a speech so powerful, so inspiring, that the outcome seemed certain. The animals were ready to follow him. And then, Napoleon did something that silenced everyone. He let out a strange, high-pitched whimper. It was a signal. 9 enormous, savage-looking dogs, who had been secretly kept hidden and trained by Napoleon, burst into the barn. They were the puppies that had been taken from Jessie and Bluebell for education. They were no longer puppies. They were slathering, snarling weapons of pure, unthinking terror. They made a direct, howling line for Snowball. Snowball fled for his life. He was run off the farm, disappearing into the dark woods, never to be seen again. The terror was absolute. The Sunday morning meetings were abolished. Napoleon announced that all decisions would henceforth be made by a special committee of pigs, presided over by himself. The animals, crushed and terrified, had no voice to object. And then, Napoleon delivered his most audacious lie of all. He declared that the windmill, Snowball's windmill, had been his idea all along. Snowball, he said, had been a traitor, a criminal, a secret agent working for Mr. Jones from the very beginning. The brave, visionary pig who had helped create Animal Farm was now the great, unseen enemy, the scapegoat for every failure, every shortage, every hardship. The propaganda machine, driven by the oily, nimble-tongued Squealer, began its relentless work. The pigs now lived in the farmhouse. They slept in the beds. They drank the milk. They ate the apples. The animals remembered that these things were forbidden by the commandments. But when they looked at the barn wall, the commandment about beds seemed different. It now read, "No animal shall sleep in a bed with sheets." And Squealer, with his characteristic, unshakable logic, explained that a bed without sheets was not a bed at all, but a perfectly acceptable sleeping platform. The pigs were not sleeping in beds, he reasoned, merely uncomfortable, raised wooden platforms. The animals, confused and intimidated, accepted the explanation. They did not trust their own memories. The past was being rewritten, one brushstroke at a time. The glorious, equal future they had dreamed of was being replaced by a new, grim, and terrifying present. The revolution had begun to devour its own children. Part 4, The Betrayal of Boxer. The years passed, and the glittering promises of the revolution faded into a grim, exhausting struggle for survival. The windmill, after immense, back-breaking labor, had been built. But a violent storm shattered it, and Napoleon, with Squealer's help, immediately blamed the destruction on the traitor Snowball. The windmill became an obsession, a symbol of the farm's devotion to Napoleon's leadership. It was to be rebuilt, stone by stone, from the quarry. And the animal at the heart of this impossible labor, the engine that drove the entire farm, was Boxer. Boxer was not clever. He could not read beyond the letter D. He could not understand the pigs' complex logic or their ever-changing rules. But he had a faith that was absolute and a strength that was titanic. His answer to every setback, every hardship, every new, crushing burden, was the same simple, powerful phrase, "I will work harder." He woke before dawn. He labored until his massive muscles trembled with exhaustion. He was the living, breathing embodiment of the loyal, exploited working class. Napoleon did not need to threaten Boxer with the dogs. Boxer's own unshakable, trusting faith in the revolution was a stronger chain than any iron. One day, after years of ceaseless toil, Boxer collapsed. He was dragging a great load of stone when he stumbled and fell. The animals rushed to his side. He could not rise. The very strength that had built the windmill was gone. Napoleon was informed. He did not come to see his most loyal worker. Instead, a few days later, a van arrived. On its side were painted letters that no animal but the pigs could read. The animals were told it was a van from the veterinarian, that Boxer was being taken to a hospital in Willingdon to recover. The animals wept with relief and gratitude. Boxer, their hero, would be saved. They gathered to say goodbye. But Benjamin, the old, cynical donkey who could read, who had seen everything and said nothing, looked at the letters on the van and finally broke his silence. The words on the van were not veterinary surgeon. They were Alfred Simmons, horse slaughterer and glue boiler. The animals screamed. They tried to run after the van, to tell the blinded Boxer to escape. But it was too late. The van sped away. The most loyal, hard-working, and trusting animal on the farm had been sold to the knacker's yard by the pigs he had served. His body would be boiled down, and the money would be used by Napoleon and his inner circle to buy another case of whiskey. A few days later, Squealer, the master of lies, came to explain. His account was tearful and full of noble outrage. The van, he said, had indeed belonged to the knacker. But the vet had recently bought it and had not yet painted over the old name. Boxer, he claimed, had died peacefully in the hospital, receiving the best possible care. His last words, Squealer sobbed, were a tribute to Napoleon and the glory of Animal Farm. The animals, eager to believe, seized upon this comforting lie. They had lost their brother, but their faith in their leader remained unbroken. The terror had succeeded. Part 5, The Final Metamorphosis. Years passed. The revolution was a distant memory. Few of the animals who had witnessed it were still alive. The farm was richer than ever, but the animals, except for the pigs and dogs, were colder, hungrier, and more exhausted than they had been under Mr. Jones. The windmill was never used for the good of the animals. It was used to mill corn, which the pigs sold to human traders for money. One day, the animals noticed something strange. One of the pigs, Squealer, was walking on his hind legs. It was a wobbly, unnatural gait, but it was unmistakable. Then, another pig followed, and another. They had learned to walk like men. The horror was complete. The animals looked to the barn wall, to the 7 commandments, the unbreakable, sacred laws of their society. But there was only one commandment left. The rest had been erased. The single, remaining sentence, painted in large, bold letters on the whitewashed wall, was the final, cynical epitaph of the revolution: all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. One cold evening, a delegation of pigs was seen welcoming a group of human farmers to the farm. Napoleon, now an immense, corpulent figure, was hosting a banquet in the farmhouse. The animals, curious and uneasy, crept up to the window and peered inside. What they saw was the final, devastating truth. Around the table, the pigs and the men were drinking together, their faces red and jovial. Napoleon and Mr. Pilkington, a neighboring farmer, were toasting each other. A quarrel broke out over a game of cards, and the voices of the pigs and the men became indistinguishable. The creatures outside looked from pig to man, and from man to pig, and from pig to man again, but already it was impossible to say which was which. The dream had ended not with a bang, but with a clink of glasses and a hand of cards. The pig had become the man. Epilogue: The lasting warning. And so, the story of Animal Farm ends not with a heroic victory, but with a quiet, terrifying, and deeply cynical merger. The rebellion that began with a beautiful, soaring song of freedom ended with the pigs and the men playing cards, indistinguishable from one another. George Orwell did not write this book simply to criticize the Soviet Union. He wrote it as a universal, timeless warning about the nature of power itself. The tragedy of Animal Farm is not just that the revolution was betrayed by a tyrant like Napoleon. It is that the very people who were liberated, the boxers, the clovers, the ordinary, hard-working, trusting masses, were complicit in their own oppression because they were too tired, too trusting, and too afraid to question the narrative they were being told. The power of the pigs rested not only on the fangs of their dogs, but on the willing, exhausted faith of the animals who simply wanted to believe that their suffering had a purpose. Orwell forces us to ask ourselves, who are the pigs in our own world? And, more uncomfortably, when have we been the sheep, bleating slogans we did not understand? I am Melesias. This has been the story of Animal Farm, as I have understood it. Thank you for listening. If this dark fable has moved you, please subscribe. And remember, the greatest weapon of a tyrant is not a whip. It is a well-crafted lie. Until next time.